On this episode of the Janus Oasis, it's a solo episode, so you just got me, Nola Simon. I'm a remote work strategist and consultant, and I've been on sabbatical since December of 2020. This episode, I'm going to talk about my sabbatical and what I discovered about it, what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, and just share with you what that experience was really like, because I've come to realize that not that many people really have ever taken a sabbatical, and there's a lot of interest in what it feels like. So, right out of the gate, I want to say that if you're interested in how you afford a sabbatical, that's not going to be the focus of this podcast. It's the least interesting part of a sabbatical. Definitely, it has to be something that you address, but so you should talk to your financial advisor, figure out with your family how you're going to plan for that. And that's just not something I'm going to go into. I'm going to talk about the feeling more, because when I look at articles, most of the articles talk about the money, and I don't want to do what most articles do. So I'm going to talk about how it felt initially to go on sabbatical and make that decision. The pandemic actually was a facilitator for that decision, because when it became apparent that my job was being restructured and I could have the time off, I made the decision that I didn't want to rush into a new job. I needed actually time to recover. My father-in-law died suddenly in 2015 after he died, and we got the estate settled, which was an estate from hell. My mother started getting sick with dementia, and she died in 2017. And 2018, even though I was only working 1 day a week in the office, I had a massive accident. I had worked myself into burnout and developed pneumonia. Didn't realize it was pneumonia. Pushed myself to go that 1 day because I was actually feeling better that day. And my lung collapsed, and I hit a double car cement hauler. It was fully loaded. And after that happened, I switched to a remote job in sales, actually. And I found that actually, even after just barely a year, I was getting bored anyway. I was looking into switching over to a strategy role. And then, of course, the restructuring happened, took that decision out of my hands. With all of that in the background, I really felt I needed time to and space to really decide what it was that I wanted to do with my life anyway. And of course, the pandemic, I'd been with my employer for 17 years. I didn't necessarily just want to walk into a new employer that I didn't know. So I wanted to take that time to consider the type of work that I was doing going forward. So I found that there was a really big identity issue right at the beginning. I found that when I was out walking my dog, people would ask me what I do. And I realized I never actually introduced myself with my job title. I never really said, "Hi, I'm Nola, I'm in sales." I introduced myself as the company that I worked for. And I really didn't go into a whole lot of details. I just let the cachet of that name really create the impression that people had for me. So it took me a while to figure out how to introduce myself. And I was Keith's wife, or Leah and Taya's mother, or my dog's mom. I'm known a lot because I'm out frequently with the dog. I'm Sully's mom. So that was all very interesting, but it's like, how do you define yourself? Not in the context of who you are to somebody else, and not in the context of what your job is. And that became a very interesting thing to me. And so I started meditating at the beginning of the pandemic, but I really continued that because I found that the more that I meditated, the more that ideas like that are complex and ambiguous and really life enhancing were easier to contemplate, the more quiet I could get. And so I follow the meditation system of Shinzen Young, which is the Unified Mindfulness System. And that's you concentrate on see, hear, feel. And I just find that's a really great way to build your concentration, your clarity, and your equanimity. And equanimity is actually the most interesting part of meditation for me, which is how can you be okay with what's happening, even though you can't necessarily control it or influence it? It just is. And so I like control. And that was, it's a challenge for me to really assess situations and just let things happen without trying to influence it. And so the beginning, maybe the first 3 months of me being on the sabbatical, I was really focused on dealing with the emotions. My feelings were hurt. If you've ever been laid off, you run it through your mind about how you could have done things differently, how things could have been done differently. And again, I've been there for 17 years. So did I make a mistake when I made change jobs in 2018? What did I do that contributed to the whole situation? And yeah, I felt hurt that I'd been selected for that. Yeah, processing all of those emotions really was a focus of that. And the other thing that I did at the beginning of the pandemic too was, or not the pandemic, but the sabbatical, was that I stopped writing because I needed to figure out how to tell my stories without having context of the employer that I'd worked for 17 and a half years. And that was actually really hard. I found in particular that I never actually thought that my writing was really specifically corporate and full of buzzwords until I was actually off. And then it was just like, oh my goodness, I sound like a robot when I write. And so it took me some time to actually find my voice to be able to write without the context of actually working for a corporation. And I highly recommend coaches. I worked with a coach. I actually only talked to her every quarter just so I would have some accountability, some progress, and a check in just basically to see how I was changing from quarter to quarter. And I found that immensely helpful because the first meeting that I had with her, I was really corporate speaking. And then it's almost like you deprogram yourself in terms of the language that you use, how you speak, how you write, and I could track that progress that way, so that was really interesting. And so I didn't actually start writing again until May or June, and so that was approximately 6 months, and so it was a good break, actually, and I had stepped away from most social media, and I popped in here and there to read stuff, but actually taking the time to process in the background without actually having to generate output was one of the best things that I could have actually done for myself too. So it's interesting because the thing that was actually helping me with my work in corporate and enjoying my job and really focusing on being engaged and doing good work, that was the thing that I needed to let go of in the sabbatical. So I found that fascinating. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is uh, privilege. So not only is it a privilege to be able to afford a sabbatical and take that time off, but you have to give yourself permission to really have that gap. There's always, for many years, there's always been a real focus on having a gap on your resume. You really want to go from one employer to another so there's no gaps, so you don't have to answer awkward questions about what you did while you were off. And so taking a year off, that's not maternity leave, that's not related to some kind of obligation that's outside of yourself. How do you tell your story in a way that's not going to hamper your career? And so there's a psychological permission that has to happen there, but it's also how people perceive you having the time off too. With my husband, it was interesting too because I've always worked honestly since, for the most part, since I met him. And so he's, what are you doing? And at one point, well, during my sabbatical, my daughter turned to me and she said, so, are you a housewife? What is it you do? And so that's a permission as well, too. And you're redefining who you are in the context of how you interact with the people closest to you in your life. And you have to be okay with that. And that's, again, going back to that equanimity thing. It's just because I'm off right now doesn't mean that I'm any less of a person and I'm any less of a productive member of society. And so that's really when I started seeing the impact of how I could actually influence people, that's when I started writing again. I found that I actually did not miss the work. I didn't miss being busy. I didn't miss calendars. Although the calendar was actually an interesting thing. How do you shape your day? How do you have structures in your day when you don't actually have a calendar that you have to update? So when my kids were in school, my calendar was roughly get them up in the morning, get them fed and dressed and out the door. They're teenagers, so they do most of that themselves. And then once they're gone, what do you do with those 6 hours while they're gone? So that was a very interesting thing because initially I would just find that the days would disappear and I hadn't necessarily done anything that I felt proud of or productive. And so not having a calendar was a real adjustment. And I wouldn't have actually thought that I was that governed by a calendar, but it totally was. So that was fascinating too. Once I started writing again, I really started talking about the things that mattered most to me in terms of impact. So the work that I'd be doing with the women's ERG, the family ERG that I had founded to support parents and caregivers at the beginning of the pandemic, I missed having that impact to help people. So the work that I missed that I felt had the most impact wasn't necessarily my day job. It was the volunteer work that I had done on the side, the communications work that I had done to attract attendees for a conference on persuasion and influence and power. That was the work that I was most interested in. And then when I was assessing with my coach how I could be of help, I really went back to what I had felt was the most value and what made the most difference over my whole career. And that was really investing in the tools and technology and the mindsets of how you set up hybrid work or remote work, because I'd done some version of hybrid or remote since 2012. And so I decided on forming a consultancy based on this type of work. How can you help an employer do hybrid remote work better? And that, as soon as I decided that, my messaging on LinkedIn and Twitter, Instagram, and very little Facebook, but all of that messaging became much more specific and much more cohesive and pointed. And that's really where I felt that my writing became much more attractive to people on LinkedIn too. And the other part was writing about the sabbatical. So sabbatical gets a massive amount of interest, I think, because people are exhausted and they are really attracted to the idea of being able to take time away and not have it derail their career. And they don't know what to do, whether to stay with their current employers or move to a new employer. And they need the time and the space to think about that. And I'm grateful that I've had that time and that space to be able to do that. With sabbatical as well, I think that you need to take a look at roles and responsibilities too. So if this had been any other time, I probably would have invested in traveling. I chose not to do that. We have a trailer. We did some camping, but so did everybody else in the world. We had difficulties getting bookings, so we didn't do as much camping as we probably would have liked. My kids, again, are teenagers. They don't love camping anymore either. So would I do the sabbatical the same way? Hopefully, if I do a sabbatical again, which I definitely would like to be able to do, I would include more traveling and learning from people. I did do an awful lot of learning. I took a future certification course to understand, how to assess an ambiguous situation and not necessarily be able to predict the future, but be able to see the signals and the triggers that are already there and how do you form the future that you want to see? How do you influence it? How do you work towards it? And so that was a fascinating certification to me. I did a lot of reading. I did, as I said, a lot of writing. And I also focused on movement. I've had a sedentary job for an awful lot of years, and I've had a couple of different car accidents, as you may have noticed. I have a lot of problems with my back and my neck. And I broke my foot once. And at the beginning of that sabbatical, I actually aggravated my foot because I tried to become really active too fast. And I injured my foot again and developed plantar fasciitis. And so that actually kept me off my feet for a good 4 months. And that's where I really invested in all of learning. And I was much more sedentary than I would have liked because of the injury. So now it's like how do I incorporate that into my day? Because I don't want to go back to a sedentary job. And the other part of sabbatical that I wanted to talk about too is when you're crafting work for yourself and you get to make the decisions of what your schedule looks like. What do you want to incorporate it? And what do you want to have that feel like? So I'm really crafting space into my planned week to be able to read, to be able to do those courses, to really have that focus and space for deep work, and really only have a calendar that focuses on the main things that I need to accomplish each day. I have ideas and thoughts on who I work with, who I don't work with, what that feels like, how I incorporate meditation and movement into my day. And so that's all part of the plan as well too. I'm planning not necessarily also for what just the next year or two looks like, but how do I pivot and make this work for another 5, 10 years? Because I don't necessarily want to retire. For the longest time when I was working, and that probably comes from my parents as well too, the focus was really just like, how do you get to retirement? How do you get to retirement age and have enough really to save so that you could enjoy your retirement? And now I have a different mentality about that. And partly that's because I watched my mom get sick with dementia and not be able to support herself. It's like, how do you build a life? How do you build a lifestyle, and how does work factor into that? How do you incorporate that into life so that you can do what you wanted to do before you even get to retirement? So I think that's a revelation for me as well too. I'm not necessarily living for retirement at this point too, because I'm crafting work that I want to do, not work that I have to do. Anyways, I that's my experience with sabbatical. That's all I can think of to share at this moment as well too. But feel free to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, are probably where most people are listening to this. So you can leave a review there. You can also leave a review on Podchaser or Good Pods. Spotify only allows for star ratings, so that's helpful as well too. And in Q3, what I'm going to actually offer is a review of the reviews that have been left for the podcast. And so responding to constructive criticism, suggestions, topic suggestions, and if there's a topic that you want me to expand upon, responding to those questions. That way we can maybe build a little bit of interaction and interest and collaboration into the podcast as well too. So that's the plan. So I'm expecting that the new episodes will probably be around April. And that's what I'm calling Q3 because I'm releasing on a quarterly basis. So it doesn't necessarily match a calendar quarter. Anyways, thank you for being here and listening to me. And I hope you find sabbatical interesting. And I wish you the opportunity to take a sabbatical at one point. I truly enjoyed it.